I'm very pleased to add my welcome and to moderate the first panel entitled Secret Society, Life Inside North Korea. As I'm sure most of you are aware, it is already June 4th in China, the 25th anniversary of the brutal crackdown on demonstrators in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. At that time, China had already undertaken a decade of reform. There were foreigners there studying, teaching, conducting research, doing business, consulting, and traveling extensively around the country. Yet the scale of the demonstrations all around China and the brutality of the suppression took most observers by surprise. This is to say, we thought we knew something about China, yet were proven wrong on many critical points. You can probably see where I'm going with this. North Korea remains a much more closed society than China was, even in 1979 when the reforms began. The international community has varying degrees of access and understanding of North Korea, and political, business, NGO, and other figures attempt to formulate and advise their governments and other organizations on policy based on very limited first-hand knowledge of North Korea's elite as well as its citizens, the privileged elite in Pyongyang and those in the rest of the country. So far, the outside world seems to have gotten it very wrong, predicting Kim Jong-un's policies and behavior. Who could have foreseen Dennis Rodman as Henry Kissinger? Yet we need to continue to attempt to gather reliable information, I hesitate to call it data, in order to deal with this very unique land. This first panel brings together 4 experts who approach North Korea with different toolkits and experiences. You can find their biographies in the program, so I will not go over them. From my left is Lee Seung-min, then Hannah Sung, Michael Kirby, and Katrina Zellweger. I will first raise some general questions and invite the panel to respond and discuss these among themselves. I will then open the floor to questions from the audience for the last 15 or 20 minutes. Please write your questions legibly on the cards, which you will find on your seat. So the first question that I want to throw out there is, in my introduction, I talked about the difficulty of gathering information, of understanding anything reliable about North Korea. How do we know anything? How do we gather data? How do we determine whether the data that we've gathered are reliable?
Well, can I say, from the point of view of the Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council, it wasn't as difficult as we thought at first it would be. The Council urged North Korea to cooperate with us, as it had earlier done to the Special Rapporteur, but they didn't cooperate, saying that they regarded the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry as a hostile political act. And so we were faced with the problem of methodology. At our first meeting, we spent a full day discussing methodology, and we agreed to do the inquiry in a way that was quite different from every other Commission of Inquiry that had preceded us. We agreed to do it in the way that English-speaking people are very accustomed to, by public hearings. And we had public hearings in Seoul, in Tokyo, in London, and Washington, D.C. It was not difficult to get witnesses. They came forward in very great numbers. In the end, we had to cut off the witnesses so that we could complete our report within the time that was fixed for us, which was effectively about 7 months to write the report so that it could be translated into the UN languages. We thought that overwhelmingly the witnesses were impressive, restrained, very matter-of-fact in the giving of their testimony. It reminded me of nothing so much as the newsreels that you see in Holocaust museums of people who've been through unimaginable suffering but feel an obligation to explain it. And so we received all this testimony. Where it was safe, we recorded it, filmed it, we put it on the internet. It's available to the whole world to see. Subsequently, 2 things happened. First, North Korea called the witnesses human scum. The best antidote to that objection is to say, have a look yourself. Have a look at the internet. Have a look at these witnesses. Make your own judgment. More seriously, China, after the report was produced, said, because you did not succeed in securing the cooperation of the state party that was subject to your inquiry, your investigation was inherently flawed and unreliable. That could not be the case. It could not be an acceptable answer. We were set up by an organ of the United Nations. We conducted our inquiry. The witnesses were, we thought, impressive and truthful. And to accept the Chinese approach would be to accept that every country of the United Nations has a veto. Now, we know from Dumbarton Oaks the trouble that was paid to get the 5 permanent members the veto. Every country doesn't have a veto. Only the permanent 5 have a veto. And therefore, China's complaint is not acceptable. So I don't think it's as hard as you suggested in your opening statement to get testimony. Oh, there's a footnote to this, that since the advent of Kim Jong-un, new barriers have been established along the border which make it much more difficult now for refugees to leave the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and therefore there is now a lesser flow of witnesses who can come forward and give their testimony. But subject to that footnote, it is not difficult to get a lot of evidence which tells the story of the horrible treatment of people in North Korea, and that is what we got, and that's what we analysed, that's what we reported, and that is what calls for international action.
Katrina, did you want to, as someone who has spent many years living in North Korea and traveling extensively, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Right. I have been involved with humanitarian aid for the North Korean people since 1995. I've visited the country for over 50 times, have traveled the whole of the country, and have also lived in North Korea for 5 years, from 2006 to 2011, heading the office of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, which is under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The question of how do you get information about North Korea? I think there are over 100 aid workers in North Korea, many working for the 6 UN agencies that are resident there. Then we have some international NGOs there. We have bilateral offices. The 2 Red Crosses are there. And there is a lot of information now available in the reports that have been published. Then there are also DPRK nationals who live outside of the country that you can approach and ask for information. And let me also say, my feeling is, or was and still is, that there is also daily life in North Korea, and the majority of people just tries to get by and lead an ordinary life, and they have similar dreams and hopes like we all have. So I would say we knew the picture is not black and white. There is a huge gray zone which we should not forget.
Could I just add that we also had access to some of the people who were working for the United Nations inside North Korea. We also had access to the country's own data and used the data, for example, on the decline in the Christian population there. But we also had access to satellite images. Some of the satellite images were defence images. Many of them were Google Earth. I mean, you can take the testimony of the witness as to exactly where the prison camp is. This is then denied by North Korea. You can then check with the satellite, including Google Earth, and what the witness says is borne out. So it's a matter of putting the patchwork together, and the jigsaw puzzle begins then to make sense. Of course, ordinary people try to live their ordinary life, as they do in every regime, but there are some horrible experiences, and overwhelmingly we thought our witnesses did not overstate things. They were very matter of fact. It was really a very impressive aspect of their testimony.
Anna?
So part of the work that our organization is doing is also helping these North Koreans who have left and escaped the country. And as we help to bring them out, and some of them are leaving sometimes as recently as a few days or weeks ago, we're able to get very recent information. And with the amount of changes that have been happening on the ground from an economic, social, and information kind of change phenomena over the last 12 to 15 years, year over year, a lot is changing inside of the country. So recent data is extremely important for us to be looking at. And so defectors are probably one of the best sources of information because there are about 26,000 of them in South Korea. But as Judge Kirby had mentioned, that number has declined. In 5 years under Kim Jong-il, there was an average of about 2,500 to 3,000 North Koreans making it safely to South Korea, whereas the 2 years under Kim Jong-un, that number has dropped to about 1,500. But again, individuals are continuing to come out, and we utilize them as a great source of information as soon as they have left to speak to some of these very important changes. Also, with Chinese cell phones being illegally smuggled into the border areas, in the border region there, many North Koreans, including my colleague Sungmin here, are able to speak to family, friends, individuals that are using these smuggled Chinese cell phones in the border. Again, as a resource to get information very recently out of the country. In fact, I think he was, we are regularly meeting with North Koreans in South Korea, and oftentimes they'll get a call as we're meeting, and it will be someone calling from inside North Korea. And lastly, I would say that there are a number of organizations that are working to help to smuggle footage out, whether it's just everyday footage of the markets or individuals, different things that they're able to bring out on video footage. Also, undercover journalists have continued to proliferate around the country with news sites like Daily NK that are reporting on information or changes or news, again, though sometimes only single source. So these are all alternate sources of information that we're able to learn from.
For the benefit of the radio audience, I should have had you asked you to tell us what your organization is and what it does, and the same for Katharina.
Sure. So our organization is LINK, Liberty in North Korea. So we're an international NGO. Our work is primarily focused, as I had mentioned, helping North Koreans who have escaped the country. We have a network of partners we work with helping North Koreans to escape out of China through a sort of underground railroad to Southeast Asia. It's in Southeast Asia that will help these North Koreans to find safe resettlement in countries like South Korea and the United States. And then we'll provide customized resettlement assistance to really help these individuals to fulfill their potential. Secondary to that is that much of the narrative on North Korea is a heavily politicized and securitized perspective. A lot of the work that we do from a grassroots perspective and also working with international media is around trying to change this narrative on North Korea to help people to look really beyond the politics and onto the stories of the people. And so by working with North Koreans, we work together to gather information, resources, to create long-term people-focused strategies to understand how we can accelerate these important changes that are happening inside North Korea.
Can I just add that the Commission of Inquiry consulted a lot of the humanitarian workers. They came to us mainly in Washington and briefed us, but it had to be on a very strict condition that we didn't identify them or the agency that they work for, lest that interfere with the capacity of that agency to continue to give humanitarian aid. And the situation being so dire in North Korea, we didn't want to do anything that would interfere with humanitarian assistance.
In my case, I was first working for the aid agencies Caritas, the social welfare arm of the Catholic Church, for many, many years. And then I was working for 5 years for the Swiss government. And those were the years I spent in Pyongyang. And we worked in the agricultural field. We had a sloping land management program. We did biological pest control for corn and cabbage. And let me just say, with the sloping land management program, after 10 years of practical experience, now the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation and the Ministry of Land and Environmental Protection, they are developing together a national agroforestry plan and a plan of action. So this is basically that policy follows practice. And we feel that's one of the little success stories. Then we also did a lot of capacity development programs where we would send North Koreans abroad for training. This could be short-term training, long-term training, whatever. We trained young diplomats in Geneva. We sent agricultural mission to Cuba to look at the land reforms in Cuba. So a huge variety of programs and projects. And one of the most interesting ones, at least for me, was the Pyongyang Business School, where we had 4 cycles, which means 4 years. And every year we would train 35 middle managers from different companies who would come every month for a 3 or 4 day workshop to learn how business is conducted in the rest of the world. It was like a mini MBA. And we had flown in lecturers from the Hong Kong Management Association. And this was highly appreciated. And we got a lot of feedback from the participants because we would do evaluations afterwards. And I remember once I was stopped in the middle of the road in Pyongyang and somebody jumped out of a jeep and thanked me profoundly for what I had done. And I said, so what have I done? And he said, my wife was at the Pyongyang Business School and she has now her own business. Come and visit her business. So we did manage to achieve a few things. We also, of course, worked in food aid by supporting the World Food Programme. Overall, let me say that the food situation now has improved a lot, but food insecurity still exists. However, when you compare, for example, UNICEF figures from other poor Asian countries, North Korean children are better off than children living, for example, in India, Indonesia, Nepal, Laos, or Myanmar. And this is thanks to the aid provided over many, many years now, but also because of some measures taken by the North Korean government.
Could I say that that's what is happening, and help of this kind is thoroughly admirable, but we do have to keep our perspective. North Korea put a whole series of restrictions on monitoring of food aid and of other forms of aid. They restricted access to some parts of their country, particularly in the north-east, and that was a restriction that meant that the World Food Programme complained that it didn't get full access under conditions of monitoring. Monitoring is essential so that you can be sure that the food aid is not simply going to the elite, but is being distributed in accordance with need. Now, an interesting, very recent development is that North Korea has said that it will lift the restriction on monitoring. That restriction led to a number of private donors withdrawing. They simply were not willing to continue to provide food aid subject to restriction on monitoring. But the recent development, one of 4 little straws in the wind that have occurred within the last 2 months, has included this statement that North Korea would allow full monitoring. And that rather suggests that the food situation in North Korea and the weather situation is, as I was told in South Korea last week, not promising, and that they would not perhaps have made this concession if there were not a need to do so. So I don't think they were doing it out of the kindness of their heart or out of a change of heart on the matter, but out of a feeling that this was something they should do for the sake of making sure food gets through to the people this time, unlike during the Great Famine of 1995-97, when an estimated 1 million people died as a result of starvation.
A number of really important points have come up so far that we could talk about for the rest of the day. In particular, this question of nuance, of understanding that North Korea is a society. There's much more diversity than we often realize, and how critical it is to try to understand from the grassroots what daily life is like. In addition, not just daily life in one particular time, but obviously, especially Katerina, because you've been going for almost 20 years now. is that there has been change. And I don't know that we could call it unidirectional. I don't think we could by any stretch of the matter. But there has been change in what you have seen and in what we understand. And I think this is where I'd like to ask Sungmin, because you've been living now in South Korea for a number of years. You grew up in North Korea. I wonder if you could tell us, help us understand what those of us who are from the outside and may be able to go on a short trip or in some cases live for longer periods of time. What are we missing, if anything? What don't we understand? What would you like to emphasize to the audience in particular?
I think it's this is a little bit, to be honest, a tough question. And just as a defector, as one of the defectors, and just I could say from the point of view of my experience. Actually, I lived in North Korea at the end of 2009 and came to South Korea 2010. So I think the international community emphasized the North Korean issues like human rights and nuclear weapon issues. I think it's really, really important to solve those problems. But also at the same time, what I'm thinking is important is for the international community to see full picture of North Korea, like not only the political or some kind of issues, but also at the same time is average life of North Koreans. Because the changing not going to become from so-called dictators, like as you have seen so far, like Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi. No dictator is going to give up, their vested interest. So change is going to be from the citizens, from the bottom. So I think it's really, really important for international community to see the full picture of North Korea, the so-called change the North Korean society.
I am very often asked, having been involved with North Korea for so long, so what has really changed? And I call the changes my 5 M's. What are they? We now have markets, and money is playing a much bigger role in the daily lives of ordinary North Koreans. We have a lot of mobile telephones all over the country. So communication has become much, much easier. Motor cars have increased. There's more traffic on the road. And I think probably the most important one is that there are signs that a middle class is developing, particularly in Pyongyang. And those are my 5 M's. And on my last trip, and I was just there a month ago, I learned that there is now even a Korean word for new rich people. And it's called, and excuse my pronunciation, it's Dongju, meaning new rich people. So I would say gradually development is coming in, has come, but not yet for all. It's a step-by-step approach. And after my last trip, I actually added 1 more M. And my 6th M is that I also feel the mindsets are changing.
Great. Hannah?
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with Katharina on many of these changes that have been happening. And I think if we can just step back for a moment to explain maybe how did these changes come about. Judge Kirby mentioned this famine that happened in the mid to late 90s, and this was massively significant. In fact, many North Koreans that we speak to talk about sort of a pre-famine, post-famine attitude toward the regime and the government. As a result of this famine, over an estimated 1 million North Koreans starved to death. But for those who survived, this sort of grassroots marketization, which has essentially become a de facto capitalism, became a survival mechanism for the North Korean people. It has become an integral part of the everyday life of North Koreans. And in fact, most of North Korea today is commoditized. And so if you have access to markets, you can access the goods that you need. But along with this grassroots marketization, one thing to note is that many of these changes have been driven by the North Korean people, as Sungmin mentioned. These were not as a result of policy changes that were directed from the government or anything of that nature. Now, while within the current government, it may seem that there could potentially be signs of changing or loose, partial economic liberalization or opportunities of those sorts, the main focus, at least for us, is that change has been driven by the North Korean people. It is continuing to be driven, and not because it's an effort to undermine the regime, but it's an effort for the everyday North Korean people to survive and to seek a better life. But as a result of this grassroots marketization, we also have some interesting social change phenomena that we've identified as a result of this. Corruption has been massively rampant and has become a way that North Koreans identify that money can essentially buy anything. But at the same token, it is also extremely unjust and unfair because of the level of corruption that exists and how individuals are being exploited. This younger 장마당 or black market generation like Sungmin, you could call them North Korean millennials if you'd like, folks that were born in the 80s or 90s, and they really grew up never knowing or needing to be loyal to the government. They didn't have a reason to be. Their attitude and their physical and psychological relationship to the regime is extremely different, and that is an important thing to note because these are the individuals that have less inhibition to consume illegal foreign media. These are the individuals who are defecting not because they're looking for food, but because of the fact that, like Sungmin, they didn't feel like there was hope. There was no reason to stay in North Korea because they didn't see hope for a future for them. And then again, information. This is extremely important because through markets, illegal information from the outside world has been able to slowly come in, and that's how people are beginning to understand this massive economic divergence between their lives and the lies they've been told by the government versus the reality of the outside world, and wondering why 30 years ago China was far poorer than North Korea. In fact, Chinese were coming across the border begging for food in North Korea. And today, North Koreans can see right across the river sparkling lights in development and see how quickly China has developed in 30 years.
And let's keep our eyes on the deep undercurrents in North Korea. I mean, one must applaud the developments that are happening and that they're good for human rights and for the people. But there are certain objective indicia. The United Nations and the World Food Programme keep figures on the situation of child weight in pregnancy. And 5 years ago, the number of births that were showing stunting were 33%. Now they're 27%. Now that's an improvement, no doubt, but 27% is still a very significant level. That's 27% of the population stunted, and anyone who knows of what happened in the Netherlands after just before the end of the Second World War with the hongerwinter will know that if you have stunting in birth, you are going to carry consequences of that right through life. Your brain has not expanded at the time it needs to expand, so it has lifelong bad consequences in 27%. This is an objective figure on DPRK's own statistics. And I think the Economist newspaper constantly says in Bangladesh it's as bad, but that isn't really the comparator. The comparator are the countries in East Asia, the countries like South Korea or China, and the figure in North Korea is way over those levels, and it's an unacceptably high level. And I myself would be very interested to know how many of the new middle class have escaped their songbun, because they're proud of the songbun system, amazing and weird though it may seem. Kim Il-sung devised the songbun system. Basically, it is not a communist idea. It's a medieval, maybe Confucian idea that you are born into a particular class and fundamentally divided into core, that's people who are supportive of the regime, hostile, those who are opposed, and wavering in between. And most people are not in the core class. Now, I would bet my dollar on the fact that the middle class are members of the core class. They're the elite who are loyal to the regime, they're given opportunities, they're given food, they're given access to jobs, they're given access to education. They're the ones who are going ahead, but those who are not in those two classes are not. And I think whilst we must applaud developments, we really have to keep our eyes on the deep underlying inequities of the system when measured against universal human rights principles.
Sorry, if I could just make one quick caveat. I will say that the economy, North Korean economy, has improved slightly, but despite the government. And I think that that's important to note, that it has not been because of the government that we're seeing some of these types of economic growth.
Well, let me just add to that. That change, from my viewpoint, has always to come from within.
That's right.
Because if change is imposed from the outside, it is not sustainable. And I think we have in today's world example where that has happened, what imposed change means. So I think that's why engagement is so important, that we can influence gradually the thinking of the people, that they want to change their own way of living and that they feel they have a right to live like everybody else live. But how do you do that if you have no idea how the rest of the world functions? And that's why I think engagement and people-to-people contact is so important. Only then people can gradually figure out and assess their own situation.
Engagement is important, absolutely, and many of the recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry were based on people-to-people contact. But you can't force a government which doesn't allow people to use the internet. They can't Skype, they can't even telephone, they can't even post a letter to somebody in South Korea. You can't, they give out 80 families in family reunion when we're talking about 100,000 people who have family connections who were seized during the last phases of the Korean War. They give these crumbs and they call that engagement, and it really isn't acceptable. It's not respecting human rights, and a little bit of pressure from outside, from the world community, saying this is just not acceptable. If you join up to the United Nations, if you sign the international treaties, and if you will not agree to a single one of the suggestions of universal periodic review, this is not acceptable. You are not complying with the obligations of the international community, and they've got to be told. They live in a world where you can be judged for this. When our report was delivered to the Human Rights Council, the ambassador for North Korea said in his response, "We have a saying in North Korea, mind your own business." That's what he said. And our response was, since Eleanor Roosevelt's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the foundation of the Charter made in the name of the people of the United Nations, universal human rights is the business of all of us, and all of us have an obligation to see as much as we can that it is delivered to the people.
Catherine?
We just heard the word pressure, and I do think there is a lot of pressure on North Korea when I think of the US sanction, the UN sanction, the South Korean sanctions. I mean, whenever I listen to any program, sanctions, more sanctions. What do the sanctions to the ordinary people? From my viewpoint, they usually hurt the wrong people. The elite lives on, the nuclear weapons program goes on, and the punishment is, for example, for us humanitarian aid agencies, because we cannot even make an ordinary bank transfer to North Korea anymore. We have to carry cash in. So North Koreans now handle much more cash, and that feeds into the issue of corruption. Because of that, we teach them the wrong things. Companies I used to work with who did things in the legal way with letters of credit and everything cannot operate anymore. So we have pushed them all into the gray zone. And is that what we want to do with sanctions?
I think Katerina gives us a reality check. I think what she's saying is tremendously helpful, and maybe it would have been helpful if we'd heard more from this point of view. But the fact is that some sanctions are necessary. In our report, we said that we should have targeted sanctions addressed to the particular people who are living well and they should not have sanctions which fall on people who have a dire mode of life simply living in North Korea. But we must keep our eye on the fact that the Security Council has imposed sanctions, particularly addressed to weapons of war, and quite recently a vessel was stopped in the Panama Canal, as we all know. It was seized. Its manifest said it was carrying sugar. They went into secret holes. They opened the holes. They found bags of sugar from Cuba in the holes, and then when they lifted the bags, underneath it were parts of MiG fighters and other weapons of war, and of course the vessel was stopped, confiscated, the crew arrested, subsequently released. But you do need sanctions, and there is a whole multitude of Security Council sanctions which, let it be said, pass through the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Nobody wants to see North Korea, with the 4th largest standing army in the world, with 20 nuclear warheads and with weapon delivery systems, with free access to international weapons of mass destruction. And therefore we do need some sanctions, and if they sometimes fall on the innocent, well, that is part of the problem of sanctions. But I'm not at all sure also that control over bank movements is not something which the international community has to look at, because the bank movements frequently stave up the elite, and it's the elite who are oppressing the people of North Korea.
I think one of the things that one of the leitmotifs that is running through this conversation is that how North Korea operates on so many different levels. And there's the portrait that is presented by both by the regime and by many international friends and critics. And then you've got daily life as lived. But then again, as you've pointed out, daily life is not lived the same way by everybody, which reinforces my point about nuance and diversity. But it's also that people, the survivalist instinct of learning how to cope, I think is definitely coming through in what you're talking about, that people are managing to survive in spite of the regime. And for the emergence of the middle class and some of these improved healthcare indices and so on, indicators, the regime can claim these as its own accomplishments as a way of trying to garner some legitimacy, both domestically and on the international scene as well. So it's it's important to be careful about how these figures are presented, as Judge Kirby has indicated. And one other point that I'm not sure if anybody wants to take up, but it's coming through, is this issue of comparability. Is there anything we can compare North Korea to, both for understanding the rhythms of daily life as well as predicting where things might go? I'm a person who spent the last 4 decades understanding China. And I went to Vietnam, I went to North Korea, and my brain is programmed to think, how does this compare to China? And so many of the things we've talked about the internet, about markets, about the middle class, as well as about corruption, around a government aware of these things and trying to suppress them or channel them. These are very extremely comparable phenomena.
But I think there's one thing that is common to them all, and that is technology. And I think technology is a great enemy to the totalitarian regime in North Korea, because even if you leave aside the access of a very large number to Chinese cell phones, which gives them then access to the internet, which gives them access to the report of the Commission of Inquiry of the United Nations, so that they can at last hear what the international community says about their regime measured against universal standards. Even if you leave that aside, there is now the intranet in North Korea. About 3 million people have access to that, 2.5 to 3, and that means they can talk to each other. They do that about markets, where food is, how much it costs, where they can get cheaper food and so on. But you can imagine that in those conversations a few thoughts might occasionally come up about the big pictures of the world about which people are interested. And so even the intranet is a different regime than the old regime, which was that you could not even leave your village without having a laissez-passer from the local authorities. The control on people moving and having contact outside, having contact with radio or television, soap operas or anything else was restricted. Now, you ask what's a comparable? Well, I don't know of something that is really comparable. The Commission of Inquiry said this is infractions of human rights of which there is no comparator, really. This is so gross for so long in so many headings, and the measure was when the first Universal Periodic Review took place, which is the system that all countries, including my own Australia, the United States, we're all subject to being examined for our human rights record. When they had their examination, the first one, under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that they tried to renounce but were told they couldn't, they got 287 suggestions from the international community of developments that they had to adopt. They didn't accept a single one. Now, one of these straws in the wind is about a month ago when they underwent their second Universal Periodic Review, they came back and said, well, there are 82 matters on the list that we are prepared to talk about. And so that may indicate that, again, there is some change that's coming. They haven't agreed to it yet, but at least they're talking about it, which is, I think, a step for which one must give credit. Also, within the last month, they have indicated they're going to send a team to the Asian Games, which is going to be held in Incheon, in the Republic of Korea, South Korea. So that's a people-to-people contact of the kind which we urged in our report. So I don't know that a little bit of pressure, if you not military pressure, but pressure to tell them about what the world expects of a modern civilized country, I think a little bit of that is not a bad thing. In fact, I think it's very much needed in North Korea.
If I can speak really briefly also to a different type of pressure that'll also be very important is the pressure that'll come from the bottom up. I agree completely with you, Katharina, in that change predominantly will come and should come from the inside out, and it will likely come from the bottom up as change has been driven by the people. But the idea is really there are very different perspectives in terms of what we've just heard. But with many of these changes, the overwhelming question is then what do we do? You know, what can be done on North Korea? Because from a political level, you know, have we really seen progress? But from where there is opportunity, one such thing that I could point out is that you know, the North Korean people have been pushing these changes, but our opportunity is to find ways to accelerate these changes. The North Korean regime is very sensitive to these grassroots changes that are happening. The reality is that they have to react and they have to adapt to them. So the more that these changes continue to happen, the more it will increase this pressure on the government to have to figure out ways in which they will either have to adapt or find ways to change their policies. But with Sungmin, to the change that you had mentioned earlier, his story is phenomenal. I mean, from a young age, really from the age of 12, he found a way to actually begin smuggling goods across the border back and forth in terms of North Korea and China. As you talk about this everyday survival of the North Korean people, Sungmin is a prime example of that. But as he continued in this business and was relatively successful in that, he was exposed to a lot of foreign media, became more aware of the outside world, all of these things. But the reality for him was still, and he can speak to this, even though people are increasingly aware of the outside world, there is still an extreme amount of fear and repression among the people. And there is still an extreme amount of indoctrination that exists, definitely more so in as you go into the country. These hotspots of change are predominantly in the border region. And so that is the overwhelming challenge, is that you have many of these changes, but you still have many of these barriers to change.
You read my mind. I was going to ask him to comment on daily life, at least as up until 2009 when he left, as experienced at least by one individual, as well as what caused you to snap? Was there one thing that you said, that's all I can stand, I can't stand no more, and I have to leave? Or was there one precipitating event, or was it just a culmination and the opportunity arose? Or something else?
You mean the...
Why you? Yeah, what made you decide to leave?
There is a lot of reasons, but I'm gonna point out these two main reasons. One was basically fundamentally is I realized how corrupt North Korean society is, like from the bottom to up to top officers. Like I learned this is through the my smuggling business, like which you cannot have done without its relations with the officers in security agents and people's security department, and to even including worker party. So all society is something like it's like it works is by bribing, and it's not. I couldn't see any future and any hope in that. So that was actually the main factor pushed me to decide to defect to South Korea. And the second reason was actually I have another older sister. She left when she was 17 to China. So during that time, I was really was harassed by the authority. Government is keep asking the about sisters. So actually, I finally had to decide to defect to South Korea to join the rest of my family. Right.
I would just like to say something. You touched upon comparison. Now, I moved to Hong Kong in 1978 and started working into China in the early 80s or late 70s. I can't remember. And I would say maybe that the closest I can compare the situation to the early days of China's open door policy, when also basically nothing was allowed and you always had to probe how far you could go. But I think a big difference is also how we assess today's situation in North Korea. And I think the West is inclined to look at it as only two ways, collapse or survival. Where when I speak to Chinese colleagues, they look at it more as survival or prosperity. And that's a huge difference. And I think that's also then a big difference in the approaches we have vis-à-vis North Korea. Personally, I do believe if we want to have change, we, the international community, can play a role and provide not only inputs, but also new ideas. And it's then up to the North Koreans what they do with these ideas. And therefore, I can only say I see no other constructive and peaceful way forward than engagement, and the more, the better.
Can you talk to us a bit about the relations among the various NGOs, international NGOs that are operating in North Korea? Are they, do they collaborate? Do they cooperate? Do they compete?
That's the nice thing in
like
Korea, actually. There are so few international NGOs and so few foreigners that you really work together. Everybody knows everybody and everybody knows everything. And then there is every Friday morning, there is this so-called interagency meeting where the UN agencies, the international agencies, visiting NGOs can meet, and that's every Friday morning at 10 o'clock. And then we have also established sectional groups. So there is one for agriculture, there is one for health, and so on. So the sharing of information is there. It is actually much more difficult for those NGOs who do not have an office in Pyongyang, who only visit sporadically and may not know that there is this interagency meeting, or may not have contacts on the ground to ask for information. And there, I think the sharing perhaps could improve. But we do have from time to time conferences, usually once a year, where we try to get everybody together just to brainstorm together, to share together. And I think these are very, very valuable.
It sounds very much like Cambodia. I was UN Special Representative for Human Rights in Cambodia in the early 1990s, and we had the same meeting of NGOs, but there was a big difference. They were very determined to build a market economy. And so at the same time as there were political acts to repress freedom and restrict free media and so on, there was a burgeoning freedom of media and information, and there was a pressure to build a free economy. Whereas in North Korea, there still seems to be a disinclination to allow that to happen freely. Allowing the markets to grow is a grudging phenomenon. And I'm still puzzled over your question, Professor Gold. What is the comparator? All I can say is in North Korea, according to our evidence, they still have public executions. They have a lot of public executions. They round up the school children and take them. Now, why would you do that? Why would you bring along school children in large numbers to see people shot? Blood, brain matter, splattering everywhere. Why would you do it? You do it to send a signal and send a message. Now, I've seen documentaries that in China they also have public executions, but I get an impression that that's not so much now. You would know more about that than I, but it's as if they are at a much earlier phase, and instead of embracing the market economy, the other side of whose coin is an element of personal freedom and less suppression and oppression, they seem to be clinging on to the old central market, central command economy, and allowing the developments to happen very reluctantly, like the cell phones and no access to an internet. Why, for example, can't the dentists of North Korea meet the dentists of South Korea? What possible restriction or what possible political reason would there be to suppress meetings between professionals? But no contacts of that kind are permitted, because these are the renegades and these are the people who want to undo our brave social experiment.
Well, hearing some of what you were talking about, the first comparable case that came to mind was the Khmer Rouge. And fortunately, they were overthrown by an outside force primarily.
Yes,
but
Vietnam,
that was the extreme,
which the Khmer, which the Cambodians didn't like very much.
Right,
having to rely on the Vietnamese.
Well, but that would also, what if the Chinese came into North Korea and to settle the situation? There's no love lost on that front. As well.
Nor also much credit given for the Chinese, inverted commas, volunteers, close inverted commas, who fought MacArthur and succeeded in stabilising it at the border.
But also thinking about China in the early 1980s, the government, when they started to lift the lid on private business to solve a number of economic, social, unemployment problems, they were very confident. Don't worry. The market will always be subordinate to the plan. The state sector will always dominate the private sector. We will continue to be self-reliant. Wow. They couldn't. The state sector still plays an extremely important role, don't get me wrong. But so much of this other stuff has gone by the way. They couldn't control this, the momentum that was generated.
You might know the answer to this, but it is said that Jang Song-tek, the uncle of the Supreme Leader and the father-in-law and so on, linked to all of the Supreme Leaders, that he was seeking to be the Deng Xiaoping of North Korea. Is that a fair comparison? Because if so, they've removed the one person who might have done it. Isn't that an amazing thing too? The second or third most important person in the country arrested at the Politburo, humiliated, taken off to a military and not a civilian tribunal, charged, judges screaming at him that he was lower than a dog. Didn't sound like a fair trial to me. No right of appeal, executed within 4 days. What a way to resolve a political difference, if that is what it was. It does sound to me as though the one person who was seeking to bring North Korea into the China model was removed, and therefore I think we've waited a long while. We've been waiting for North Korea to hear these messages, to respond, to see how the world goes, but they don't, there's only so much talk that you can do, and meantime people's human rights are suffering. And that's why the international community, we can go on talking for a century and there may be no action. There has to be a responsiveness to this. And that's why one clings at the straws in the wind, that they're beginning to talk about the 82 matters that they will discuss. Let us hope that that is a sign that things are changing for the better.
I think that it's important to note, though, that Kim Jong-un has only been in for a very short time. And the reality is also that his father had, 17 years to prepare to take leadership, whereas he had a mere short 2 years. I think the last few years, absolutely, we're not seeing the type of change or reform or progress that we'd like to see. But I do think that it is maybe a bit early to make that type of a brash assessment to say that there is not any potential to see any sort of change, because I think that there have been some signs, there have been some signs that there could be potential interest in trying to move towards these types of small changes, again, in economic liberalization and experimenting in these small ways. But the reality is at the end of the day, the government's primary focus and priority is regime survival. And so anything that could destabilize that or threaten that is what they're balancing. And so they're having to do it very, very carefully, regionally, experimentally, so that they do not undermine themselves in this manner.
And reluctantly.
They don't have a choice. They realize that the current system is absolutely unsustainable. And Kim Jong-un, I'm sure, does not want to find himself in a position where he's seen many of these other leaders where they've had a much less desired fate happen to them.
But I do think the key to North Korea is also that there is no trust. And as long as there is no mutual trust, things cannot happen. So we have to build up trust and relationships and then move gradually forward. It has taken me 20 years to where I am now, but why would the North Koreans ask if we could not help them to create the business school? So obviously they want to learn how the world ticks, how business is conducted, how they can also create win-win situation. It's slow, I agree to that, but my experience in China goes into the same direction. It was very slow then too.
Very slow until it was very fast. But the
Right.
trust issue, do you mean among the North Korean people or between North Korea and the outside world?
And the outside world.
Because I think the level of trust among the North Korean people is also very low, which is, I think, also
but
in
that
China.
is something I wouldn't like to judge. I think it's very difficult to say anything about that, but the trust between the outside world and North Korea is not there and that's why, people say, oh, U8 agencies only see a sanitized version of the country. That might be true at the beginning of a relationship, but the more they trust you, the more they show you the reality of the country. And I have seen some horrible things there, but they have showed it to me because they hoped either Caritas or the Swiss government would be willing to help them, to show them a way forward.
Could I add a sort of a comparison to what Katerina has been saying? It's something I felt when I was reporting to the then Human Rights Commission on Cambodia. It is a wonderful thing that we have lived to an age where people from North Korea, and in those days Cambodia, have to come to a very big hall in New York, the Third Committee of the General Assembly, or in Geneva, and now the Human Rights Council, and answer criticisms and do so before the whole world. And that is the world we're living in. Now, that doesn't immediately build trust, but at least it gets into the minds of those who have to come forward and give their answer, that other people see things in this way, and just maybe on some things, maybe on 82 things, other people have got some insight that we have to take into account. And this is really an achievement of the United Nations, which began here in San Francisco. I have to remind you of this. And also, you've got very steep hills. You could go into the business of steep hill agriculture. I think it's really made for steep hill developments. But building international human rights is a very steep hill. And at least we've begun the process. It's like Runnymede. We've begun it, and it's not going anywhere. It's not going to go back. Little developments are happening, but the question is, will the developments happen quickly enough for the impatience of the international community of the horrible human rights record as it is revealed? And will there be a resolution of this internal tension both within North Korea and in the international community?
As Chairman Mao said, a single spark can start a prairie fire. And I think that the Chinese communists as well as the North Korean leaders are very worried about putting out as many potential sparks as they possibly can. Well, going through the cards, there's a general desire to hear Sung-min talk more about not only his experience, but also now that you're living in South Korea, what role do you think the South Korean government, South Korean NGOs, South Korean religious organizations should play separate from or in collaboration with many of the other international actors in trying to promote change in North Korea, in trying to, if not promote change, at least improve the lives of the people in North Korea? We also hear that in South Korea, many young people really don't care very much about North Korea. Unification is not something that's high on their agenda. Please comment.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for having the opportunity. Yes, it's already. I think you might already have now some changes already happens, among North Koreans, especially the mindset of North Koreans toward our government, our North Korean government. So, yeah, I think it's very important. Like as you commented, human rights in record in North Korea. I also personally have seen a lot of public executions in person from the age of elementary school. And actually, the public execution is it's just like a frequently happened in North Korea. It's not always something secret anymore in North Korea. And also, I think it's when you see the reasons why North Koreans are able to change into their mindset toward their government it's really important. Is like information, like NGOs and it's a government. While international community pushing North Korea to change to improve its North Koreans the humanitarian condition, also important like NGOs like Link and some other organizations to get information in North Korea. So for example, as a North Korean, it's really, really important since the North Korean government uses all the methods to block the inflow of foreign information into North Korea and out of North Korea. So when I watch I'll give you just a single example. When I was young, while smuggling, I also received a lot of some foreign media such as South Korea and China and sometimes American soap operas and movies. But it was really, really affected on our mindsets to change because North Korean government had taught us that enemy countries like the South Korea is such a poor country and there is a lot of people, it's homeless people and children looking for food in trash bin. So we truly believed it, since we didn't have any source of information. But after watching a movie, I was really, really shocked and surprised by seeing the highly developed society. But to be honest, in fact, when I watched the first time movie, I was skeptical about it because I thought that was propaganda designed to overthrow the political system of North Korea, because North Korean government had to keep talking us about this enemy countries, the so-called United States and South Korea, that produced the decorative films, right? So overthrow North Korea. But things like after watching such movies, like as I watch a movie, I became aware none of them actually criticize North Korea, but actors usually describe the average South Korean lives and focused on subjects like dating, love, breakups, especially something triangle love or something like that. So it didn't seem designed to overthrow North Korean government. So, and it's really amazing to us. That's why from my friends, I began to question what we had been taught to believe. And I also had some chance to watch American movies. But the funny thing is, all American movies I watched were kind of movies. People in that shooting at each other by guns and auto rifles they had. So that's why I thought Americans should have been kind of a battlefield. So that's why when I visited 2012 for the first time, I was really afraid of visiting America. So I thought I might not have a chance to come back alive from America. So anyhow, visual images on the video has enormous effect on us because, when I watched the movie, I couldn't see homeless people in the movie. Instead, we watched the countless skyscrapers, many cars on the street, and fashionably dressed South Korean people. It was really, really amazing. But thing is, the North Korean government also knows how dangerous this foreign information is to its government in terms of maintaining its government regime. So that's why it tries, to take all the measures to block information. So, do I still have time?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna comment. It's just like example how North Korean government the crackdown on foreign videos. Usually, it's a buffer routine household research. Inspectors will disconnect the electricity without prior notification. So once the electricity cut off, it was impossible to remove a DVD from DVD player. So I learned about this the hard way. I was caught with the DVD stuck in the DVD player and was harassed for nearly 2 weeks for information about where I got it. But fortunately, I was able to manage to bribe one of the head inspectors. I remember with the 5 carton of expensive cigarettes. So he finally let me go. So, but later, I bought a car battery as a backup power supply to remove a DVD out of DVD player in case of a surge. And then I used to hide DVDs under the ash in the fireplace after wrapping them in a plastic bag. So I think the North Korean government, tries to block the inflow of foreign media. I think people continue to buy them, watch them, and bribe their own way out of punishment. So I think people are more aware of the outside world. So I think it's a recent source. The USB sticks is getting popular because it is easier to smoke in and also easier to hide, in case of surprising surge. So I think this is really, really important in terms of information. So organizations like Link or I know as long as I realize a lot of these organizations works on human rights issues on North Korea, so I highly like to recommend for them to do this.
One quick comment, if I can make, is this was a single source. The Daily NK, who has journalists inside the country, recently reported a few days ago that obviously the North Korean government recognizes the threat that this information poses. From this source, they said that the North Korean government recently changed their criminal code to now include 5 new things. One of which is consumption of foreign media could now potentially be punishable by death.
Well, on that note, yeah.
I think that
perhaps if I could say something about my experience with foreign media. Every 2 years there is an international film festival in Pyongyang, and embassies that have a presence there can show 2 or 3 films there. And we always did that. It took me ages to figure out which films were appropriate, because exactly for the reasons Lee Seung-min just said. And I've never seen the movie halls full lot than during the International Film Festival. And I watch kids who would have a ticket, and then the movie hall would have perhaps 5 halls where they could watch a different film, and they would go every 15 minutes to a different movie hall to see what the other film was showing. I mean, this is a non-threatening way of bringing information in, and I would encourage that, because my big worry is also if you do it illegally, are you not going against the do no harm principle? And that worries me.
Well, I'm not sure. I think so many people are doing it illegally because it feeds a real need. And I don't think I've ever heard a better description than was given by Song Min about why it's so insidious. But, you know, in our own countries, we've been through this. When I was growing up in Australia, one of the most insidious pieces of information that was going around was a most horrible soap opera which had a hero in it who was gay. And that was so insidious in the 1980s. And as a young gay man growing up, I would go home and I would watch that. And that was also tremendously important to me. Just seeing everyone else in the video was weird and horrible, but the gay man was the only one who was sane, he was rational, and he was a lawyer. So sometimes soap operas can undermine orthodoxy in our own countries, and they're being used in Latin America for teaching about HIV and attitudes to HIV. So I say I wouldn't be putting any restrictions on illegal use of the soap operas because I think they really are very undermining. And if they've now made a criminal offence with a death penalty, well, the fact that so many people are watching them shows what a thirst there is for knowledge which is being forbidden. And ultimately, knowledge and new technology will beat the oppressors.
Speaking with people who had grown up in the former Soviet Union and in East Germany and elsewhere in the communist world, in China as well, one of the things that they stress is the importance of information and the importance of engagement, which I think is one of the things, with caveats, but one of the things that has definitely come through quite clearly in our panel. And the importance Judge Kirby just raised of role models of how to behave, if given all these different kinds of situations in which people find themselves. Is there some appropriate behavior that people can model themselves, pattern themselves on? I believe that we are out of time for this panel. There's still many, many questions that people have raised. We have another panel that I think will provide another opportunity to address them. And I want to thank our panelists for their really extraordinarily insightful comments.
May I make one last remark?
Here I was building up to
I'm so sorry. I wanted to, before you got there, I wanted to make one remaining comment, if I may.
Go for it.
I know how frustrating it is to come to these events and to only learn and not walk away with knowing what can actually be done. And so if I may just close with one suggestion. I didn't manage to get this in before, but I think North Korean refugees, as I'd mentioned, 26,000 of them are in South Korea, and they are playing an extremely important role, like Sung-min here, as agents of progress. And whatever way you look at it, I don't think that we should see engagement or pressure on North Korea or calling these things out as sort of one or the other. In fact, many of these strategies, I think, are possible to work together, as many of the recommendations in the Commission of Inquiry, in fact, do propose engagement while also addressing many of these very important challenges the North Korean people face. But many of these North Korean defectors, there are opportunities to actually help them and to support them, whether it is helping them in coming out, whether it's supporting programs that encourage these types of exchanges legally and legitimately, to learn business, to learn trade, to learn these types of things. And these North Korean refugees are playing an important role back into the country, a role that none of us can play by sending actually money, remittances, and information back and forth. And so there is an incredible opportunity we do have on the outside to actually do something on this issue to support individuals who are able to promote positive change.
And can I add one sentence?
I've lost control.
I think we should learn from the AIDS epidemic. Jonathan Mann at the very beginning insisted never have an AIDS conference without a person living with HIV speaking. Never have a conference on North Korea without a person from North Korea who can explain it as it is.
Absolutely.
I think, again, going back, the role of engagement, the role of bringing North Korea into the into the global community is critical. And I think even though the question was raised in some of the cards about who gets to attend these MBA programs, who gets to go abroad, yes, these are definitely going to be people of the elite, people of the trusted group, but at the same time, they talk to other people. The information spreads through many different channels. And yes, it's slow. Yes, it can be nerve-wrackingly frustrating, but I think that this is critical. And I hope that one of the issues that can be addressed in the next panel is what if the United States tomorrow decided to establish full diplomatic relations with North Korea? I'll leave it at that. Thank you again very much.